Mail order, bride. Can't conceive children. Rancher with 6 orphans says she's answer to his prayers. Denver Union Station, autumn 1889. A brass whistle screams, steam blooms, and Eleanor Whitaker, 26, travel-worn, unshakably poised, stands with a battered suitcase and a letter that she has read to tatters. Samuel Dawson of Cedar Ridge writes of 6 children and a table with 1 empty chair, of fences needing mending and lullabies no one remembers. He does not write what he hopes her body can do. Boston's physicians pronounced her barren. Society pronounced her unfit. She sold the piano, the silk dresses, the future that had her name on it, and bought a westbound ticket with the change. A gust hammers the platform, tangling auburn hair and lifting a scrap from the envelope. A penciled postscript she somehow missed. Tell me the worst you carry, and I'll tell you mine. The line burns hotter than coal. Does Samuel suspect, or is there another weight waiting in Wyoming? Heavier than any secret she owns. Boots clack. A newsboy shouts. Somewhere. A baby wails, then goes quiet. Eleanor presses a palm to the tender hollow below her ribs and pictures 6 small faces in aspen light. Clara steady, Luke and Levi bright with mischief, Abigail ink-stained, Hannah soft-voiced, Benjamin dimpled and fierce with joy. She imagines the rancher's hands rope-scarred, gentle, and the instant those hands learn the truth. Boston named permanent. Cedar Ridge. The conductor calls. The mountains stand like a jury. If she speaks now, the future may break. If she waits, trust may sour. Either way, the train leaves in 1 minute. In the window's reflection, she finds a stranger wearing her mother's locket, eyes steadier than fear. Eleanor folds the letter, tucks it against her heart, and steps into the carriage. The wheels bite forward. What Samuel didn't know about his bride could unravel everything. What happened next will shock you. Eleanor took a window seat as the train eased forward, and Denver fell behind in smoke. Steel wheels marked time, while cold light washed prairie grass, and the days steadied her breathing. Samuel Dawson's letter lay under her glove, creases mapped to the bones of her wrist. Paper smelled of dust and pine, as if the ranch breathed through linen fibers. Boston lingered like moth smoke, mirrors, whispers, cancelled calls, and verdicts spoken gently to wound deeper. The physician's words had been tidy and final, closing futures with a pen's quiet click. Her fiancé praised honesty, returned the locket, and avoided neighbors for 3 days, then disappeared. She sold the piano, flattened silks, and hid coins in a needle tin for luck. A westbound ticket opened a door no salon would ever admit existed or approve. Mountains gathered on the horizon, blue and severe, shouldering clouds like long-practiced burdens. A child counted telegraph poles until numbers blurred. A lantern swung, a hymn threaded air. Eleanor reread the letter, 6 children orphaned by a mine explosion, a house needing steadiness. Fences failed after gales, calves were due. Mornings outnumbered hands, evenings lacked stories and song. He asked for a wife who could teach figures, tend rooms, and protect laughter. He did not ask for heirs, yet silence between lines seemed built for expectation. Eleanor's replies offered ledger's lessons, patience, thrift, and cheerful endurance learned in harsher rooms. She did not write the burning sentence, "My body will never carry a child." The omission rode beside her like a fox under a porch, poised and hidden. Foothills sharpened, pines stepped nearer, air thinned to metal, windows breathed frost along edges. Sage scented the drafts, cinders tapped glass, geese arrowed south under a hammered sky. She matched breaths to rails, a ledger balancing motion and fear with careful arithmetic. Eleanor pictured Cedar Ridge from descriptions, modest porches, swept steps and horizons that discouraged gossip. A general store promised coffee, nails, lamp oil, stamps and news pinned every Wednesday. A schoolhouse held slates that whispered, chalk dust lifted like low snow in sunlight. Rumor named a woman doctor, brisk and steady, quicker than any argument about propriety. She imagined Samuel gentling a colt, rope scars pale, voice lowered to borrow trust. Kind eyes in ink suggested courage married to weariness and night decisions taken alone. Children gathered color as miles burned. Clara deliberate, twins bright, Abigail intent, Hannah listening, Benjamin exuberant. Clara 15, probably kept accounts, guarded recipes, and managed mischief with practical, even fairness. Twins Luke and Levi, 11, would dare fences, fix hinges, and argue improvement into exhaustion. Abigail 9, sketched barns and swallows, taping pages like windows that refused loneliness. Hannah 6, stored words carefully, then released one perfect sentence when quiet required kindness. Benjamin 2, loved wheels, hats, spoons, horses, shoes and rain, sometimes all together, sometimes sequentially. Hope arrived in pocket scenes, a seat offered, a hot drink, a stranger sharing bread. Despair proud, lean yet father each hour. The land required honesty and rewarded attention. Rivers braided silver, antelope lifted faces, sunlight rolled over hills like hammered tin. A conductor punched tickets solemnly, performing a ritual that soothed travelers who trusted routine. Eleanor tucked the letter away and sketched a schedule to calm her thoughts before arrival. Morning sums, mid-morning reading, midday chores, afternoon recitation, evening hymns and stories by lamplight. The plan smoothed worry, though truth still snagged like a thread, refusing the needle's eye. Vendors boarded at Cheyenne, with apples. Troopers strode by. Boys waved with theatrical importance. A woman asked the destination. The town name left Eleanor's mouth as if a vow. The syllables rang soft yet lasting, a bell note marrying courage to intent. Boston went unspoken. The broken engagement stayed folded with the final silk dress. She promised steadiness, thanked the stranger, and watched purple dusk collect along the plains. Cards clicked softly at a rear table. Pages turned. Wolves announced distances beyond map. Her reflection gathered over glass, paired with black fields sliding under the locomotive's rumble. She wished to arrive honestly, yet feared honesty might cancel the welcome before names settled. Prayer rose spare as winter grass, asking usefulness, courage and tenderness ready for storm. Morning lifted peaks nearer than rumor, blue where shadow pooled, white where wind polished ridges. Willows stitched creek banks, cattle dotted hillsides. A hawk hung motionless on invisible nails. A bell clanged. The engine exhaled. Houses sharpened like a photograph developing in trays. Cedar Ridge appeared tidy and small, hitch rails straight, smoke braiding from kitchen chimneys. A hand-lettered sign promised sugar, coffee, seed, rope and posted letters without fail. Children dashed between barrels. A dog herded dignity. A blacksmith hammered sparks into noon stars. The station smelled of cinders and cinnamon from a bakery window glossed with frosting. Eleanor stepped down, ankles stiff, heart steadying as if travel had trained discipline into muscle. Samuel stood apart, 35, hat tipped, jaw shadowed, coat cuffs worn, buttons exactingly polished. Kindness lived in his eyes beside sleeplessness, and choices completed before appetite could interfere. He reached for the suitcase only after her nod, lifting it as though meaning mattered. Miss Whitaker, he said, voice low and roughened by work, warmed by fulfilled promise. She answered his name, something unknotted, recognized not as solution, but as arrival's true shape. They walked toward a wagon, where a gray mare flicked an ear with tolerant interest. Samuel drove slowly and pointed out landmarks with a modest pride that never asked for admiration. The general store sold axle grease and ribbon, sometimes together when trouble and celebration collided. The schoolhouse stood square on a rise, so rain drained rather than sulked in corners. The clinic shared a porch with the telegraph, because news and needs traveled paired in winter. Beyond town, meadow lifted, then timber, then peaks wearing October like a quilt on shoulders. Eleanor stored details the way threshers stack sheaves, each bundle ready when work begins. Road dust rose, tasted of flint and settled behind wheels that kept faith with rut. They passed a church, 2 saloons, a livery and children launching ashwood boats along a ditch. The ranch reached 1,500 acres, boundary to boundary, watered by 3 reliable creeks. Fences required mending after gales. Calving began early, if storms behaved, which storms rarely granted. Coyotes tested pastures nightly. though dogs and riders discouraged grand appetites with steady presence. He described difficulties like weather, expected and manageable, fierce sometimes, never theatrical or hopeless. Eleanor asked about the children. His face deepened with attention rather than brightened with display. Clara kept accounts, managed meals and moderated twin schemes before mutiny complicated breakfast. Luke built devices from scrap, convinced that patience and nails could transform useless into indispensable. Levi argued methods towards safer, faster, better, occasionally all three within one breath. Abigail sketched everything, then taped drawings to walls, turning boards into windows nobody shuttered. Hannah spoke softly, yet her sentences landed square, true and unexpectedly wise when required. Benjamin adored wheels, hats, spoons, horses, shoes and rain, enthusiasm tumbling faster than steps. They turned through willows listening like neighbors, and crossed a plank bridge, rattling yet trustworthy. Pasture opened, corrals followed, then a log house chinked neatly, porch swept to the corners, smoke lifted from a stone chimney, sunlight lay late gold over yard and barn doors. A windmill ticked, a rooster announced obvious facts. The mare snorted a greeting toward remembered company. Eleanor climbed down and stretched carefully, determined to meet introductions with steadiness rather than nerves. Clara stood on the porch, apron unspotted, hair braided, gaze level and appraising yet kind. Twins flanked the doorway, identical except for a braided hatband that betrayed one maker's pride. Abigail shielded the paper from the breeze, then held a drawing so the newcomer could see. A barn and mountains filled the page, lines confident, perspective anchored, shading respectful of distance. Hannah peered from behind a beam, eyes luminous, ribbon clutched against bravery gathered for greeting. Benjamin advanced, halted, considered, then offered a solemn pebble, currency recognized by toddlers everywhere. Samuel presented names, ages, and tiny histories, courtesies braided with warmth and comfortable pauses. Eleanor returned each greeting with a detail from letters, proof of attention rather than performance. A breath she had been holding escaped, gratitude shaped like relief and respect for care. From the porch, fields lay in long rectangles, aspens edged drawers, distant snow caught light. The air tasted of hay, iron, wood smoke and something bright she dared to call possibility. Inside, rooms waited sturdy and plain, scrubbed planks, quilts pieced from work shirts, shelves of crockery. A clock ticked companionably, measuring neither doom nor triumph, simply time available for honest labor. Eleanor studied faces, yard, horizon, and felt her outline redrawn by welcome thicker than feet. She would teach, mend, tally, soothe, listen, and learn, duties chosen freely rather than assigned. The secret still rode beside her, heavy, unspent, yet the road ahead refused shame's narrowing. Samuel carried the suitcase inside and set it gently on a rug woven in earth tone. Whatever storms come, we meet them together, he said almost to himself, like a rule weather honors. Eleanor nodded, hearing wind lift while the house tilted slightly toward her with steadfast intention. Night gathered along fences, dinner scents drifted outward, beckoning with ordinary grace and uncomplicated promise. She crossed the threshold, certain of little, yet sure of this: usefulness can build a home. Outside, stars pricked frost-dark skies while coyotes stitched distance with yips and ounces. The porch boards kept the soft echo of boots and small shoes, a rhythm of arrivals pressed into their grain, and Eleanor felt that cadence as Samuel opened the log house door and let her step into heat that smelled of wood smoke, onions softening in a black pan, yeast rising at the back of the stove, and damp wool steaming on pegs. Two lamps threw steady circles across a table scrubbed pale tin plates stacked by size, a crock of salt beside a neat row of blue mugs, and a clock that ticked like a calm heart. The house was cozy by necessity rather than decoration. Braided rugs laid to protect the plank floor, a shelf of hymnals, a narrow cupboard full of jars labeled in Clara's careful hand, and a windmill's faint clack sent through the chinks as if the prairie itself were breathing. Clara stood at the stove with sleeves rolled and an apron tied sharply. 15 competent, composed, brown hair coiled without a stray, eyes measuring the newcomer with fairness rather than suspicion. Eleanor offered to chop carrots, waited for permission, then set her knife to work in rhythm with the spoon. Clara guided through the stew. The gesture landed where it should, neither intruding nor performing, and something unknotted between them. The twins slid along the wall like fox kits, curiosity fighting the urge to swagger. Luke, a shade taller, wore a hatband braided from rawhide and blue string saved from feed sacks. Levi's mismatched buttons spoke of speed and midnight tinkering. Both had the honest constellation of small bruises gained from fences and experiments. They peppered her with questions. Where from? How fast is the Denver train? Can you throw a loop? And she answered just enough to keep their sparks bright without turning the moment into a show. Then asked them to sketch their newest contraption on the back step after supper. Abigail waited near the mantel with a sketch pad. 9, shy in letter, yet here shyness felt like precision rather than retreat. When Eleanor asked, she opened to a drawing that caught the log barn in late sun, boards reaching toward the roofline, a ladder at an exact tilt, a hen in profile, dignified as a senator. Lines ran true, shadows nested where they should. The page held the quiet truth of attention. Eleanor admired craft, asked what pencil she preferred, and the girl's shoulders eased as if someone had returned a lost coin. Hannah peered from behind a bedpost with ribbon clenched, 6 quiet, chin high in the way bravery sits when bravery costs effort. Eleanor crouched to tie her own boot, left a small space for choosing, and a whisper crossed it. Help. She matched the hush, offered a thimble like a traveler's charm, and told a quick tale about a needle that loved to wander and never failed to find its way home. Hannah took the thimble, turned it, and smiled like a candle catching. Benjamin arrived with ceremony, 2 years and thunderously joyful, presenting a solemn pebble and a wooden horse missing a wheel, then lifting sticky hands in a request no household denies. She settled him on her hip, sliced potatoes with the other hand, and felt the room tilt toward an easier axis. Samuel in the doorway watched with tired pride that softened without show. Small gestures set bridges faster than speeches. Eleanor asked Clara which spice belonged in the stew when frost threatened. Sage arrived in her palm like a baton at the perfect bar. The twins launched into their cart idea: barrel hoops, a plank seat, pegs not nails, a rope break, and spoke over each other until she proposed a chalk diagram. At once they were engineers, arrows marching, improvements blooming, rivalry transformed into collaboration. Abigail, still listening, fetched a blue pencil stub for emphasis without being asked, and that too bound something invisible. Outside, the evening sharpened. Golden leaves rattled across the yard, tapped the sill, and kept going. A bucket swing hung motionless. A coil of rope held memory of daylight games. A brown dog arranged himself like a gatekeeper and declared all arrivals approved with a single tail thump. Beyond the porch, the pasture turned pewter, the sky holding to its last light as long as possible before surrendering. Supper came on time. Bowls went out, bread followed, butter arrived, and nobody began until Samuel lifted a spare grace, giving thanks for food, work, safety, and weather that might remember mercy. Talk ran easy, chores finished, a loft cat with opinions, a tale about a bear on a far ridge repeated with affectionate doubt. Laughter landed softly. Eleanor kept pace, not auditioning, simply present. She cut bread evenly, buttered the heel for Hannah, lifted Benjamin's spoon with a rhythm that made him certain success belonged to him, and shifted the salt near Clara's elbow the instant it was needed. After the dishes, the twins begged rib. She gave them a door with no hinges, no key, and a golden treasure inside. Luke shouted egg before Levi finished repeating the words, and then both howled at the speed of it. Victory shared, because amusement had no edges. She offered another and asked Abigail to whisper the answer into Hannah's ear, so the quiet one could triumph aloud. Candlelight caught the small smile, and that was a kind of benediction. She helped Clara wipe and stack without being told, learned where each plate returned, where the mugs nested, and how the cloth folded to fit the drawer. Clara, not quick with flattery, granted a single nod that meant earned respect rather than sweetness. In the scullery, a washboard leaned by a tub, a rack by the stove waited for wool socks, A bar of spruce soap sat on a saucer nicked by winters. Eleanor asked which days suited washing and which stayed for baking, repeated the choices, and tucked both into memory because reliability builds trust faster than charm. Samuel joined her at the threshold, when yawns grew contagious. He spoke with that gentleness men keep for sleeping babies and skittish colts, then said a few plain words that warmed more than the fire. "You make the house feel light." He praised her easy way with the small ones, the twins' diagrams, the fact that Clara had let someone else stir her pot without bristling, and the way Abigail had shown more drawings tonight than in months. Gratitude settled on Eleanor like a shawl. It also sharpened the truth she still carried. For a breath the air thinned the way high country thins it, and she steadied herself on the table edge where lamp glow gilded her glove. The secret pressed at her ribs, asking when honesty would arrive. Fear answered that honesty might cancel the welcome her hands had just helped earn. Outside, the first hard stars pricked the dark over the elm. The brown dog made a final patrol, then curled by the hearth with official satisfaction. Hannah claimed Samuel's chair with a book, turning pages carefully, while Abigail drew by lamplight, recording breadcrumbs and laughter like a scribe documenting a parliament. Luke and Levi argued pegs versus nails with cheerful rigor. Clara wrote a list for tomorrow in tidy lines. No wind could blow crooked. Eleanor sat and mended a cuff with a borrowed needle, small stitches teaching cloth to remember wholeness. The house breathed around her, a soft thunder of contentment that sounded like surf made from wind and kin. Boston's parlors, all brightness and sharp eyes, felt far as another world. No tug pulled her back, yet longing still rested where the doctor's verdict had burned a hollow in her life, and even as affection unfurled, she felt the risk of disclosure loom, large as a mountain cresting beyond a last stand of aspen. She promised herself she would not lie. She also begged time to set deeper roots before stones were overturned. Have you ever found family in unexpected places? Share your story in the comments below. The sentence floated through her thoughts with a tenderness that surprised her, like advice from a future self. Later, when small bodies had been guided upstairs and the twins sent to douse their lantern after one more whispered calculation, Eleanor crossed the mantel to return the thimble to a jar of buttons. A carved box rested there, its lid closed, a candlestick beside it, and a square of lace pressed under glass. A photograph stood at the edge of lamplight. The silvered surface held a woman with calm eyes, and a mouth that looked ready to tilt into a smile if someone offered a gentle joke. The dress belonged to another season. The pose belonged to days when time allowed for sitting still. Eleanor felt the room shift as if the house itself remembered. Samuel's voice softened behind her without asking for attention. "That was Mary," he said, and the name touched the air like a blessing that had cost dearly. He did not add dates or details. He didn't need to. Grief can be heard in what a voice doesn't reach for. Eleanor kept her gaze steady, nodded once, and placed the thimble in the jar. The children's laughter still seemed to hover under the rafters, but now it braided with a quiet older than tonight, and the braid held. She understood that tenderness here began long before she stepped through the door, and she recognized the dignity of that history, even as fear reminded her that truth, when spoken, might ask the past and present to renegotiate their peace. She folded her hands, breathed the mix of wood smoke and rising bread, and let the photograph teach her one more thing about the man who had written a letter to a stranger and left room in his house and heart for an answer. Frost silvered the meadow before dawn, tracing every blade and nail with a thin shine that cracked under the first footfalls. And by breakfast the wind had a sharper edge that made breath bloom white. At the doorway, Eleanor built the morning around steadiness. She set sums on slates and a verse to copy beneath them, laid readers by height, and tied an apron while the kettle began to chatter. Clara, precise as a clock, sifted flour with a wooden spoon and nodded when Eleanor offered to stoke the fire and wet a cloth against the rising heat. They moved in companionable silence, corners smoothed by practiced hands, until the twins thundered in with two brimming pails, held out like trophies, and a plea to time how fast they could carry the next pair without spilling a drop. Eleanor agreed on one condition: the path must remain safe for little feet. Their grins flashed. A contest turned into collaboration as they planned a route around slick boards and a stray rake that waited like a prank. Lessons filled the parlor. Numbers first, neat as fence posts. Then reading aloud, each voice steadying as unfamiliar words lost their thorns. Eleanor guided pace without fanfare, answering quick questions with quicker examples, praising effort more than answers, because effort, like kindling, catches first and carries everything that follows. Afternoon, the washtub took command. Laundry day taught rhythms. Town life never asked from her. Clara, sorted by weight and fabric, showed how lye soap wanted patient water rather than impatience, and steered Benjamin away from the wringer with the authority of a quartermaster. Eleanor rolled sleeves, plunged sleeves and stockings, lifted against the board, and learned when the cloth itself said enough. They made a line between two poles, pulled it taut, and pinned shirts that flapped like small white flags. Surrendering to sunlight, the twins dragged a bench under the line and invented a game where a clothespin became a soldier on a mission to cross the yard without falling. They narrated the journey so vividly that even the brown dog joined as an escort. Abigail drew the scene, catching the tilt of sleeves, the curve of steam, the triumphant exactness of a pin's little mouth. Hannah hovered at the edge with her ribbon, quiet, cautious, observant as a bird near a boot. Eleanor coaxed her toward words with stories that carried no demand, only invitation. She began a tale about a wind that learned every name on the ranch but forgot its own. Where do you think it looked first? Hannah touched her ribbon to her chin, as if it were a compass, then whispered, the creek. Eleanor nodded as though the guess had solved everything, answered with a detail about ripples, and passed the story back and forth until sentences lengthened, confidence grew, and the ribbon rested without being clenched. When frost lingered into late afternoon, they boiled potatoes, stirred stew, then shifted evening tasks. Samuel returned dusted with the day, hat brim bright with rhyme, a coil of rope over one arm, and a quiet that meant deliberation rather than trouble. At the table, after grace, he spoke of feed, fence, calves, and the bridge that would need new planks before real ice came. Then his voice dropped to a place reserved for truth that reshaped room. He told Eleanor what she had only gleaned from hushed lines in letters and the photograph on the mantel. Mary had labored through a storm while he rode for help, the lantern swinging like a star in a mean wind. And when he came back with the midwife, the storm had already chosen. The child did not live, neither did the woman who met him, the day his brother's children arrived with soot on their faces, and too much quiet behind their eyes. He spoke without spectacle, as men do when memory has already burned away everything that isn't necessary. Eleanor listened with hands steady on her cup, and a softness in her chest that felt like reverence. She understood that sorrow lived here, without asking attention, and that the gentleness Samuel gave the world had a cost measured in nights wider than talk can span. She also felt the secret inside her harden into a task she could not keep postponing. He deserved plainness, the children deserved it. She would need to find the words soon before vows braided their days tighter than truth could undo. After supper, while Clara tallied staples and Abigail taped a new drawing above the shelf, Luke and Levi tugged Eleanor toward the yard to prove a theory about a hoop and a stick. They had built a course around the well and back to the porch. She raced them once, pretended to lose by a nose, then demanded a rematch with rules they created together. No elbows, no shortcuts, and a song during the final turn. Laughter broke the cold, bright as a struck flame. Hannah sat on the top step, ribbon tucked into her pocket, and told the dog he had won the cheering prize. The dog accepted with dignity. When bedtime gathered, Eleanor tucked blankets at feet, smoothed hair from foreheads, and left a story half-finished, so morning would have a reason to arrive early. Ever faced a truth you were afraid to share? Tell us how you found courage. The question drifted through her thoughts, not as a performance, but as a nudge that turned her inward, where promises are made and kept. The next day brought visitors. Miss Eliza Thompson arrived with a basket that could have served a church social, cheeks rosy from the wind, eyes quick with amiable assessment, and a mind that liked decisions almost as much as good bread. She had come to discuss a date, flowers, a parlor arrangement, a minister who spoke too long unless restrained by clear instructions, and a cake that would travel by wagon without losing its pride. She praised Samuel with a frankness that embarrassed and pleased him in the same breath, calling him steadfast for shouldering grief while raising his brother's children like his own, and telling Eleanor that love on this land often looks like chores done on time and fences fixed before anyone complains. Practical holiness, she said, patting Eleanor's hand as if inaugurating a partnership, and promised cloth borrowed from a cousin for ribbons if the shop's shipment failed. At the clinic later that week, Eleanor met Laura Peterson, a woman who wore certainty instead of apology and ran her rooms with a tidy efficiency that left no corner to doubt. Shelves carried tinctures, gauze, needles, a stethoscope that gleamed like a small bell, and a ledger recording remedies against winters that arrived early, meals skipped, fevers outrun, and babies landed safely after rides that would have daunted saints. Dr. Peterson asked Eleanor to wash, sort and cut bandages, then showed how to fold cloth so it opened clean in a hurry. She quizzed her on boiling time for instruments, signs that a cough had traveled too deep, and the difference between a bruise you watch and a bruise you worry. In those brisk hours, Eleanor felt the old Boston rooms lift off her shoulders, those parlors where women were decorations to conversation rather than engines of help, and she realized that usefulness could be a calling rather than simply defense. On the way home, Samuel spoke little, content with the sound of the creak under the bridge, the harness creak, the wind humming wire. When he did speak, it was to say that the clinic helped more than anyone admitted, and that a person's worth here traveled by what their hands could be trusted to do. He told her he had once thought a household could be built by sheer will and strong arms, then learned that tenderness must be chosen daily, because work without tenderness wears the soul thin. She tucked the words close. That night frost climbed the panes, feathering glass with white ferns, and the lamp threw delicate shadows across the quilts. Eleanor lay awake listening to coyotes announce territory beyond the cottonwoods, and decided she could not let trust grow on soil that withheld water. The guilt had turned days into a map with a blank section she kept pretending did not exist. She imagined telling him on the porch, under stars with wind for a witness, because the wind can carry promises away if they are not meant, and return them if they are. She imagined the children asleep, the dogs circling once and settling, the yard holding silence the way a field holds snow before the sun touches it. She did not know what his face would do. She only knew truth belonged in this house, where even laughter had weight and work deserved respect. A wedding could not be built on a withheld fact without that fact eventually creaking through the joints. Morning's cold sealed her resolve. She rose early, tied her apron, and set the table while coffee sputtered and the sky softened at the rim with pearl light. When Samuel came in rubbing his hands, she told him she wished to speak that evening, after chores, before decisions fixed themselves beyond recall. He studied her, not wary, simply attentive, then nodded once the way he did at a fence line squared and tight. Eleanor poured, passed the mug, and felt fear, relief, dread and hope braid into something that could hold a life upright. Before dusk, she would find the words, and whatever followed would be honest enough to stand. Stars salted the black above the yard, while the windmill ticked and the porch boards held a quiet that felt ceremonial, and Eleanor sat beside Samuel with her hands around a mug that had long since cooled, breath whitening in the chill, while cattle shifted beyond the cottonwoods and the dog settled by the steps, as if he understood that tonight required witnesses who would not interrupt. She had asked for this hour at breakfast, had carried it through chores like a tally toward courage, and now the house behind them glowed with lamplight while quilts were shaken, boots paired, and whispers upstairs climbed toward sleep. She told herself that truth kept homes from listing, that secrecy rotted joists, that love deserved unvarnished ground. Then her mouth refused to begin. Samuel did not hurry her. He sat with elbows on knees, hat hooked over the rail, profile cut from shadow and patience, the sort of patience people learn only after weather has made them humble. Crickets stitched the pasture. A frost line crept silver across the yard. The sky rolled generously with constellations and early ice. She thought of Boston describing certainty as manners, medicine describing certainty as a verdict, and the way shame could make a person believe silence was moral. Samuel, she said, and the name steadied her tongue. I have carried something heavy across every mile that brought me here. I should have written it plainly. I could not. She felt him turn toward her, gave herself no more room to retreat, and laid the sentence down, as if setting a glass globe that might break under any excess. I cannot bear children. The air answered with nothing, which was somehow louder than any outcry. Her body prepared for recoil, a bench pushed back, a voice hardened, the careful formalities that arrive when trust collapses. Instead, Samuel's breath moved once, slow, his fingers tightened against each other. His face received the words like news he had not planned for, but had the strength to carry. Pain crossed him, brief and unhidden, and then something quieter took the place where anger might have stood. He asked when she had learned. She told him about the room with velvet chairs, and a doctor whose voice tried to be gentle, and succeeded only at being final, about a fiancé who praised honesty while returning a locket, about invitations that stopped arriving, about a train where she made herself into usefulness, because usefulness felt like proof. A person deserved air. She did not ask forgiveness, she only asked him to know. He looked toward the dark barn, toward the cold glitter beyond the tree line, and when he spoke, his voice held gravel and rain, and the steadiness that had kept 6 children from drifting after everything else fell. I posted that notice for the sake of those kids. I owe them mornings that don't break, and nights that end with a story. I needed a partner who could help me deliver that, not a womb. They are my legacy. I will not measure a life by blood alone. Eleanor let the words sink through her ribs, and set. Warmth did not arrive triumphantly. It arrived carefully, like coals coaxed awake, yet the ache did not vanish. It changed shape, became guilty for delaying candor, until the porch and not the pain. Samuel reached without flourish, and covered her knuckles with a palm that smelled faintly of rope and cedar. You should have told me earlier, he said, but you're telling me now. She nodded because the truth of both sentences fit. Silence pooled again, companionable rather than brittle. They listened while a late gust combed the aspens, and set one loose leaf to skate along the step. Eleanor spoke of fear, of the way hope makes cowards of people who have been punished for hope before. Samuel spoke of Mary, of a lantern thrown wild by a storm, of hands that could not change what a night had decided. Neither speech asked for pity, each honored a scar. She lifted her eyes to the present and found that it held. What defines family for you? Share your thoughts below. The words rose inside like a prayer shaped as a question, a summons to kindness larger than any single house. Morning would bring the wedding. Tonight brought the truce between old damage and new trust. Inside, Clara checked lists. The twins tested knots. Abigail arranged a drawing where sunrise would find it. Hannah rehearsed one brave sentence. Benjamin slept with a wooden horse tucked under his arm, as if guardianship could be gripped. Sleep finally came. Dawn carried the sharp blue of cold that promises a clear day. Eleanor dressed without flurry, buttoning a blue wool bodice the shade of deep water, smoothing a skirt hem. Clara had basted until it fell right, fastening a mother's locket, whose chain had survived every departure. Clara braided her hair with fingers that betrayed no tremble, then pinned a ribbon stitched the previous night. Mrs. Eliza Thompson arrived early with bread that steamed when the cloth lifted, eyes bright with mission, voice deft at wrangling details, into order. The parlor held sprigs of aspen and a quilt draped over the mantel as if endurance itself were decoration. Neighbors came with handshakes, quiet jokes, a box of cookies, and a solemn promise from the blacksmith to keep his remarks short. Samuel stood in his best coat, brushed so carefully that a person could imagine every bristle counted. The children flanked him like facets of one bright stone. The minister accepted coffee, reviewed the words he would say, and vowed brevity. Eleanor stepped into the room and felt heat under her cheeks and steadiness under her steps. Clara's eyes shone, not with tears but with a satisfaction earned by helping build a morning that would hold. Luke and Levi quivered with barely contained energy, exchanging nods that signaled a plan to ring a handbell exactly once at the proper time. Abigail had tucked a small sketch into a book where the vows would rest. Hannah clutched a thimble and a line she would deliver when asked, practicing it under her breath like a spell. Benjamin examined shoes and declared them splendid, then whispered an opinion about cookies that made 3 adults fight back laughter. The ceremony began without spectacle. The minister spoke of steadiness, weather, bread, and the honest labor of love. He asked for promises, and promises were given, not as fireworks, but as timbers set true. Eleanor said yes, and meant it with the totality of a life rebuilt. Samuel said yes and meant it with the gravity of a man who had learned how easily the world can take. Rings passed from palm to palm, with a hush that felt like respect for every absent hand. Sunlight shifted across the floorboards. The stove hummed. The wind leaned on the wall and listened. When the moment came, Clara placed the book with calm ceremony, Abigail's drawing hidden inside like a blessing that would surprise them later. The bell rang exactly once. Neighbors clasped shoulders. Mrs. Thompson dabbed her eyes and declared the cake perfectly upright. Dr. Laura Peterson stood by the doorway with the look of someone who trusts both skill and providence and expects both to be needed by nightfall. Eleanor received embraces that did not weigh her or estimate her, that did not press future demand. The contrast with Boston's clattering hospitality felt stark. No evaluation here, only welcome. Even so, guilt threaded the hem of joy. She had not lied in the ceremony, but the confession should have crossed paper months earlier, and that knowledge shadowed the brightness like the edge of a cloud moving over hay. They cut bread, poured coffee, divided slices, and accepted tea. Luke and Levi presented a contraption that showered colored paper when a string was pulled. The room roared while the device wheezed triumphantly. Hannah delivered her sentence exactly, then hid against Eleanor's skirt when applause arrived too loud. Eleanor bent and thanked her at ear level, where gratitude counts double. Abigail pressed a folded page into her hand later, a small study of 2 chairs on a porch at night, and Eleanor understood that a child had seen more than adults believed. Samuel's palm found the small of her back as they moved among friends, not possessive, only present. The day thinned toward late afternoon, toward the light that makes wood glow and faces soften. When the house finally quieted, when plates had been washed, when the dog resumed his ordinary patrol, Samuel and Eleanor stood beneath the mantel and looked at each other as if the room might take another impression of this pair, and keep it. He reached, she rose. Their mouths met in a kiss that tasted of coffee, cinnamon, and winter coming, a kiss built on gratitude, grief, work, rescue, risk, and a promise to continue. Hope pressed forward. So did the shadow, her regret at the delay, the worry that relatives or rumor might someday twist tonight's honesty into something meaner. The moment kept both truths without breaking. They parted just enough to breathe, and the house, steady witness to storms already endured, accepted the new vow with a faint settling sound like a ship finding deeper water.
Morning came raw and metallic, frost whitening the pump handle, leaves tumbling in nervous spirals across the yard, when Dr. Laura Peterson's buggy rattled up the lane and halted hard. She dismounted before the mare stopped, handed the reins to Luke with a glance that allowed no argument, and said the mining camps north of Cedar Ridge had woken to fever, rash, and rumor. A foreman's daughter burned through the night. 2 men coughed blood at dawn. Panic would travel faster than wagons if households did not set rules by noon. Samuel brought her to the porch while Eleanor stood with a basin halfway to the table, already counting towels, cups, and places to station water. Masks, the doctor said. Boiled cloths, no sharing utensils. Windows cracked, despite the cold. Hands scrubbed until the skin protested. And children kept from company unless work demanded passage through town. She left tincture, a small tin for chafed lips, and a list of signs that required a rider at once. Strawberry tongue, a rash that refused pressure, fever that climbed and would not answer cloth, confusion or a sudden quiet that scares even brave people. Then she drove to the next place, dust jumping after the wheels. Eleanor moved as if the porch had struck a bell inside her ribs. Basins filled, kettles rolled, towels were marked with charcoal, mugs labeled in chalk, and a line was strung indoors to keep damp rags from freezing. Clara divided duties with a steward's calm. The twins fetched water in relays and argued about which path caused fewer spills. Hannah clipped lemons with careful hands. Abigail lettered a reminder by the pump that made washing feel like a badge of honor. Benjamin watched from a chair with a blanket over his knees, solemn as a judge, cheeks bright and eyes brighter, and Eleanor felt something tighten behind her breastbone at that unnatural color. She touched his forehead with the back of her wrist and found too much heat for morning. He did not cry, he blinked and asked for a story about the windmill learning to count. She began at once because stories smooth fear in the listener and the teller, and because his fingers already fluttered as if trying to fly away from his own skin. By noon the wind fussed along the eaves, nagging a loose shingle, sending a bucket rolling until the dog stopped it with one authoritative paw. Eleanor measured the day with small repeating mercy. Broth warmed, cloth cooled, water offered, shade adjusted, a cup moved, a toy horse cleaned of dust with quiet dignity, as if even wood deserved comfort. Samuel stoked the stove, split kindling, checked latches and kept his voice low, as though loud tones might jostle fever into rage. Twice he looked to Eleanor for direction and obeyed without pride, passing the basin, lifting the child when shaking began, standing near when the shaking ended so the air would feel thicker, safer. Afternoon darkened early, as weather and worry often conspired. Abigail, barred except for errands, stationed herself at the threshold and drew the shape of care in quick lines, Eleanor's hand steady as a shelf, Samuel's shadow leaning like a shelter, a bowl eclipsing lamplight. Clara fed the smaller ones, then cleaned handles, rails and the latch until metal shone like ice. Luke and Levi ran messages to neighbors, left notes for Mrs. Thompson, and returned trying to appear taller than 11. Evening arrived with red at the rim of the sky and distant hammering from the blacksmiths, a comfort because industry meant the town still moved. Benjamin's fever lifted, then surged a tide with an unkind moon. Eleanor counted breaths and named them to keep from losing count. In, out, step. She changed clothes so often her hands wrinkled, rubbed salve across knuckles, and kept going. When he moaned, she bent and told him the windmill had reached 20 and would not stop unless he helped it find 30. He smiled once, a small crescent, then slept with the seriousness of a soldier on a little field. Near midnight, Samuel brewed coffee so strong it scalded the cup. They shared it in turns like travelers sharing a post when snow hides the trail. He said nothing useless. He thanked her once, and the word felt like a beam set under a roofline that had threatened to bow. Outside, leaves hissed along the boards. The dog paced. The windmill ticked like a metronome, keeping time for courage. Eleanor counted that ticking, counted breaths, counted cloths, folded wet side in so heat, left through the clean square. Counting steadied her in a way sleep could not. Twice Benjamin startled awake and cried for his sister. She laid his palm on the toy horse and said it would stand guard if the boy rested. Samuel's rope-scarred fingers lifted the bowl when she reached for more water. Their hands touched. Neither pulled back. Toward dawn, the fever peaked. A terrible summit reached with teeth chattering and skin blazing. Dr. Peterson returned on that wind, hat plain, bag ready, eyes sweeping the room before a word passed. She checked tongue, glands, a faint blotch that faded under pressure, and watched long enough to trust her conclusion. Not scarlet, she said, voice pitched to land gently. A fierce cold with a hard climb, but not that. Relief did not shout. It loosened ligature. Samuel's shoulders dropped. Clara's jaw unclenched. The twins exhaled together and pretended they had not. Eleanor said thank you without looking up because tears waited, and she could not afford salt near the child's mouth. Orders followed. Continue fluids. Sponge often. Air the room. Keep siblings apart another day. And rest the nurse as you can. The doctor pressed Eleanor's wrist and said she had hands the frontier trusted. Praise landed like a quiet medal. Neighbors drifted in with caution and generosity. Thompson set a stew that could feed a crew, scrubbed the table and pinned a caller's schedule that would not exhaust the house. The blacksmith tightened a hinge and left 2 oranges as if he had robbed a bank for treasure. Abigail slipped her drawing onto the mantel. Hannah brought 3 words and a kiss for Benjamin's hair, then retreated with the gravity of someone entrusted with a holy object. Luke and Levi argued about a window angle to admit air without dust, built a wedge and tested it like engineers. By late afternoon, Benjamin slept without jerks, woke long enough to sip broth, and fell under again with a breath that finally sounded like a child dreaming rather than a straining engine. Eleanor wiped his temple and realized her arms trembled. Samuel noticed, caught the cloth before it slipped and told her to drink water, eat bread and sit while he watched. She obeyed because pride wastes strength when duty may ask for more by dusk. The chair accepted her weight as if made for this pause. When she rose, the room appeared wider, as though air had returned to the walls. Evening came clean and blue. Stars began early. The wind dropped to a murmur. Peterson stopped once more, listened, smiled with the satisfaction of a maker whose device had settled into proper motion, and said they had done well. At the door, with her bag buckled and hand on the latch, she added a line meant as comfort, tossed like a ribbon across good news. "A house this steady invites blessing," she said lightly. "After scares like this, families often find new life." Then she was gone, wheels fading toward town. The sentence hung in the entry like a note that would not resolve. Eleanor's stomach tightened as if the floor had shifted under. She leaned against the jamb and folded the rag without seeing it. Samuel, unaware of the barb inside the gift, followed to thank their neighbor. Praise had filled the house all day, earned by competence and care, and still the old wound woke at that careless promise. She imagined a future visitor repeating it over coffee. She imagined fine script on a Boston card carrying the same assumption. She imagined a question from a child years from now that she could answer only with a story about love shaped by work rather than blood. When the door opened and Samuel returned, she had composed her face. They stood a moment over the sleeping boy, listening to that even breath that sounded like grace. He whispered that he did not know what the house would have done without her. She said the children had drawn her a map, and the map had guided her hands. He touched her shoulder and left to bank the fire, and she sat again to keep watch until Clara came to trade places. Midnight settled with a sky so clear the stars seemed near enough to gather in a bowl. The dog stretched and sighed. The windmill clicked once and held still, satisfied. Eleanor rested a palm on Benjamin's blanket, felt warmth that belonged to health rather than rage, and let the quiet promise of morning without argument. Love had taken root deeper during these hours. The house had shown her where every beam lay, and how each room carried its share of courage. Yet guilt walked beside gratitude like a shadow that would not deter. She had told Samuel the truth, yes, but late. And even now a stranger's well-meant remark could lift that lateness like a scab and find the ache raw beneath. She promised herself she would keep speaking plainly whenever the world tried to write their future, even as fear visited when footsteps paused outside the room. Benjamin stirred, sighed and settled. Eleanor adjusted the cloth and watched lamplight thin along the wall until it became a soft ribbon. Morning would bring chores, bread, lessons and a story to finish for Hannah. For now she sat between mercy and regret, loving this family more fiercely than she had words to confess, and haunted still by the long echo of her earlier silence.
Autumn hardened edges across Cedar Ridge, until fences clicked at dawn and horse breath lifted like pale banners, and Eleanor rode into town with a medical satchel balanced against her hip, mittens tucked under a wool cloak Clara had mended meticulously. Frost stitched the meadow with delicate seams, then crisped along the creek where morning light broke into small fires, and her mare stepped carefully between ruts that held yesterday's wheel marks. The clinic bell chimed, thin yet steady. When she pushed through, shelves greeted her with neat rows of tinctures, bandages, clean jars, and a brass scale gleaming beside a ledger inked in Dr. Laura Peterson's efficient hand. The doctor nodded once, a signal that meant, wash, boil, prepare, then began rounds as if handing a baton to an eager runner. Eleanor scoured pails, laid cloth on trays, tied packets with string, and tested water with a thermometer before instruments touched the bath. Learning how patience is another instrument. Patience arrived under briar that smoked like chimneys, a ranch hand with a cut laid open by barbed wire, a seamstress nursing a puncture from a stubborn needle, a boy who had toppled from a fence and believed his arm was shattered when it only wanted rest. She cleaned, wrapped, soothed, counted breaths, and kept talk measured, repeating instructions until frightened eyes unhooked from panic. Peterson taught distinctions between pain that warns and pain that lies, between a cough that barks and a cough that drags, between fever that needs shade and fever that demands a cot. While she practiced, confidence gathered the way light accumulates on snowfields, bright quietly, then bright enough to guide. At midday, Miss Eliza Thompson swept in with bread still steaming beneath a towel, declared the whole town would bounce back faster if sensible women set the calendar,
and proceeded to schedule house calls with the certainty of a general preparing a campaign. Between bites, Eleanor listened to stories that stitched humor through hardship: calves birthed in blizzards, gardens salvaged after hail, letters carried by strangers who had nothing to gain except goodwill, and felt her own history loosen its grip. Work replaced dread, usefulness pushed against the hollow where shame had once nested. After lunch she saddled again for errands the doctor could not spare time to run, riding past the blacksmith whose hammer rang like church bells for iron, past a schoolyard where Clara had begun practicing lessons for younger pupils on borrowed afternoons, past the general store window stacked with paper, lamp oil, peppermint sticks, and sewing needles. The mare's hooves tapped a metronome on planks outside the post office while she gathered parcels, prescriptions, and a letter from a widow asking if the clinic might speak at a church circle about fevers. The road home unrolled under skies the color of pewter. Aspens shed gold like coins no one could pocket. Wind shaved heat away until her cheeks prickled. Evenings at the ranch, tasks braided smoothly. Sums with Hannah whispered near the stove. Diagrams with Luke and Levi at the table where gears, pegs, and wheels colonized one end. Bread sliced for the little boy who now calmed when she lifted a cup to his lips. Benjamin tried the name Mama one twilight, testing the shape with a sleepy grin. It landed without fanfare, yet something inside her settled as if a long search had found coordinates. She kissed his hair and said thank you, a benediction under her breath. Clara brought her notebooks to the lamp and explained lesson plans, asking about clarity, sequence, and ways to turn stubborn sums into games. Afterward, she practiced reading aloud so pacing would hold a room. Eleanor offered gentle edits and stepped back, careful to honor the girl's growing independence. Abigail found a north window where light behaved, painted with a thrift of pigments. Peterson had bartered from a traveling salesman and displayed small landscapes that caught snow on distant ridges like lace. Hannah's sentences stretched longer each week. She told the family how a kettle hum becomes a song when company listens, and nobody corrected poetry dressed as fact. The twins engineered a proper windmill using salvaged blades, an oiled spindle, and a promise to tighten bolts whenever weather shifted. They argued furiously about pitch, then conceded improvements with magnanimity rare for 11. Samuel, watching from the porch, grinned at their contraption and said the ranch would turn the sky into water yet. On Saturdays, Eleanor returned to the clinic for demonstrations, splinting, stitching, brewing willow bark tea, weighing powders, labeling vials, recording temperatures, and transforming messy pain into orderly relief. Her hands learned economy: no wasted motion, no lost lint, no panicked rush. Precision bred calm, and calm spread. Farm wives began bringing children straight to that clean room because the two women there would treat them without sneer or sermon. Mrs. Thompson told everyone that Boston polished shoes while Wyoming polished hearts, then laughed until her hat pins rattled. Samuel met these changes without jealousy. He arranged chores to free her mornings, drove the wagon to town when storms threatened hooves, and waited outside the clinic with coffee he swore tasted better on that corner than anywhere on earth. At night he read aloud when voices drooped, lifting paragraphs from a farmer's almanac as though prophecy could be found between moon phases and frost dates, then tucked Benjamin into bed while the dog completed a perfectly serious inspection of every room. Trust grew thick as quilts, so did humor. Luke and Levi presented a model of their windmill weather vane that spun whenever someone spoke too loudly. Hannah pronounced it a good reminder. Clara measured flour for morning loaves and told them she had been invited to assist at school twice a week, which set the twins cheering so wildly that Samuel had to herd them outside before crockery leaped. Abigail painted a portrait of the clinic door and gave it to Peterson, who hung the little canvas beside a framed medical diploma from a place that had never expected a woman to stand beneath its seal. In town, men tipped hats while women offered recipes, remedies, and unvarnished advice about keeping courage when cold months stacked failures like cordwood. Eleanor learned to speak without apology when requesting supplies, and merchants responded by setting aside items likely to help: extra blankets, stronger thread, tin cups that stood up to scrub. She began to think less about what she lacked and more about what she could build with steady practice. Even memories from Boston changed color, losing their power to humiliate. The past became a map showing where not to waste footsteps. Some afternoons the clinic held small chaos, A miner stumbled in with grit in both eyes. A teamster needed stitches across a knuckle. A teacher fainted from not eating breakfast after 2 nights grading slates. Eleanor worked through each event with a sequence she could now recite in her sleep. Wash, clear, assess, clean, dress, explain, document, encourage, observe. By the first deep freeze, the twins' windmill pumped reliably. Clara gained classroom hours. Abigail's canvases brightened a store window. Hannah spoke with new assurance. Benjamin called her Mama as if the sound had always known its road. Neighbors began asking for Eleanor by name. Samuel rearranged chores so mornings stayed free and waited with coffee outside the clinic when storms prowled. Mrs. Thompson arrived with cakes, ribbon, and tales of lantern lines that outlasted blizzards, because women fed wicks each hour. Toward the month's end, the town convened to plan for winter. Eleanor stood, hinted at rooms that once measured her wrongly, and described women's work as infrastructure and care as shared wealth. Dr. Peterson promised instruction on Saturdays. Boots drummed approval. Frost took the steps. Stars hung sharp, and walking home between Samuel and the children, Eleanor felt Cedar Ridge had folded her fully into its story.
2 years later, the air came bright, cold, and clean. A crisp autumn day ringing like hammered brass from fence to ridge. And Eleanor rode the southern pasture, at first light, with a medical satchel lashed to the saddle, a ledger tucked beneath her cloak, and a stethoscope warming in her pocket, so metal would not bite skin. Frost-stitched silver seams along ditch edges, wagon ruts glittered, cattle blew white banners, and a hawk steadied itself on an invisible nail above aspen crowns burning gold. The ranch had fattened after steady seasons. Fences set true, hay stacked in neat pyramids. A new cistern pooled where snowmelt once wandered, and the twins' windmill turned wind into water, with a hum that felt like a pulse for the yard. Inside the house, porridge steamed while Clara, taller and surer, packed primers for the morning class at the schoolhouse, chalk wrapped in a kerchief beside the Bible. Her pupils' mothers took turns lending. Luke and Levi, all elbows and pride, polished their turbine blades with rags, arguing amiably about vane pitch, then sprinted to the shed to compare a pump gasket they had carved from leather against one the blacksmith had cut from rubber. Both boys accepted failure as the cost of invention and moved on cheerfully whenever an idea refused to hold. Abigail stood at the north window and painted the first blue on a canvas. The general store had promised to display before Thanksgiving, her little landscape selling fast enough that merchants paid in coin and tea while neighbors paid in eggs and favors. She worked in quiet concentration, eyelids smudged by pigment like a vigil's shadow. Hannah wrote stories on folded sheets. She stitched into tiny books, paragraphs about dogs who guarded moonlight, girls who could hear creek stones speaking wisdom, and windmills that learned to count storms. She read softly to Benjamin, who wore a school cap and a badge made from string, certain that both conferred great authority. The smallest had become a student who returned each noon with crumbs on his jacket, and urgent reports about letters that looked like fences, numbers that and a teacher who granted him the job of ringing a brass bell exactly once when recitation ended. He greeted Eleanor as Mama without thinking, an address that lit the room each time it arrived. Samuel met her in the yard with a grin that lived easily now, a page of figures, and a question about moving ewes before the weather carried ice across the ford. He paused to tighten the cinch and pressed her glove once, a quick private salute that said more than speeches. She rode through pasture light that sharpened everything as if the world had been washed in cold water, then turned toward Cedar Ridge along a road the clinic had taught her by heart. The brass bell chimed when she pushed the door. Shelves stood ready with tinctures, instruments and jars labeled in neat script. The stove ticked and Dr. Laura Peterson greeted her partner with a nod that contained both pride and expectation. The morning filled slowly. A seamstress arrived with a finger she had sewn through. A miner limped with a stone bruise that had frightened him more than it hurt. A ranch hand coughed from dust and needed instruction about steam and rest. A small girl with a splinter cried until Eleanor told a story about a traveling needle that loved returning home, turning panic into bravery long enough for the forceps to work.
She measured, brewed, stitched, wrapped and recorded, steady now in ways she once only practiced under her breath. Confidence did not swagger, it moved carefully, but it no longer asked permission to exist. Neighbors spoke her name with the ease reserved for necessary people. Miss Eliza Thompson swept in, wearing a hat that could rout weather, delivered bread, traded jokes like currency, and rapped the counter with affectionate authority while recounting how her sister's lantern line had held through a blizzard, because women fed wicks each hour without waiting for applause. Word of such acts had always been the backbone of the Ridge. Now Eleanor listened as one who belonged among the keepers of those accounts. When noon came, Samuel waited outside with coffee that steamed into the white air. He asked about patience, accepted her summary and said the twins meant to pipe windmill water to a trough near the corral before the freeze. She laughed and said she would write the clinic schedule while they dared hydraulics. She returned home by mid-afternoon, wind sharper, sun cleaner, shadows lengthening across stubble like script. The house met her with the domestic orchestra she had grown to love, pages turning, kettle humming, stove hissing, the dog's nails ticking a friendly beat. Clara rehearsed tomorrow's lesson with a calm cadence that had started to carry the authority of a grown teacher, then closed her book and asked for counsel about a stubborn reader, who masked fear with jokes. Eleanor suggested stories that might coax honesty without embarrassment, and Clara nodded, already rewriting the plan. Luke and Levi dragged her outside to witness a test, shouted blessings at their machine, opened a valve and whooped when water surged. Failure, success and revision, braided into one exuberant stream. Abigail wiped her brush, showed the mountain fog she had captured with a thinned wash, and smiled when Eleanor named the precise ridge. Praise felt less like decoration than companionship on a long trail. Hannah handed over a stitched booklet and asked, very seriously, if words could become bridges even when people felt far apart. Eleanor promised they could, then kissed the top of the small poet's head. Benjamin clattered in with his slate, reported the day's triumphs and asked whether courage was a number, a letter or a song. Eleanor answered that it sometimes hides inside work, care, and learning wove themselves into a pattern so sure that former judgments seemed like the wrong map folded inside the right one. How have you grown through challenges? Share your journey below. The question floated through her mind as if someone had pinned a card to the air, but now it felt less like a plea than an invitation she had already accepted. Shame had lost its voice. Usefulness and tenderness had gained a choir. She no longer measured herself by an absence. She measured days by meals shared, wounds cleaned, lessons taught, roofs secured, and laughter that held through storms. After supper, Samuel spread papers on the table, cleared a space among gears and paints, and spoke with a shyness rare for a man so competent at weather and repair. The State Association had written to Dr. Peterson, requesting a speaker for a Denver gathering on frontier medicine and women's instruction, and Laura wanted Eleanor to lead a training program for ranch wives and town girls that would extend beyond this valley. He said the Ridge needed more hands that knew what to do at midnight, and he believed she could teach them to trust their own steadiness. The children erupted as if someone had shaken a bell. Clara promised to keep the household ledger while Mama traveled. The twins vowed to maintain pressure, the pump, and not test anything that whistled in a worrying way. Abigail asked if a sketch of the clinic might serve as a gift. Hannah began writing a sentence that would fit in a pocket. Benjamin declared he would guard the dog and the windmill, both vitally important. Eleanor looked at the letter again, saw the seal, saw her name, and felt the old tremor flutter once before folding into resolve. She thought of Boston parlors that had once made her small, of trains that had carried her toward usefulness, of nights cooled by cloth, of mornings warmed by porridge and lesson bells, of the porch where truth had finally taken its place. She no longer bargained with fate. She pressed Samuel's hand, told Laura yes the next day, and began laying out notes with the same care she gave a patient's bandage. Topics in order, tools packed, questions anticipated, confidence rolled tight but ready to unfurl. On the eve of departure, she stood by the wagon while stars pricked the sky and frost began tracing its thin script across the rails, and nerves came like sparrows, quick and insistent, impossible to scold away. She breathed, pictured the clinic door, pictured faces that would learn and pictured her family in the lamplight waiting for news. Empowered, she climbed up, adjusted the cloak, and felt the ridge lift her like a tide. Denver would listen, home would hold.
The grand hall in Denver rose like a ship's hull, turned upright, paneled in dark walnut, and strung with lamps that burned steady against an afternoon leaning toward frost. And when Eleanor stepped onto the platform, a tremor passed through her knees, then settled as if the boards themselves lent backbone. Women filled the rows in calico, wool and city silk, some with ink stains on their fingers, some with needle pricks across thumbs, some with ranch dust bright on hems, and their faces carried the frank concentration of people accustomed to work that counts. She set her notes on the lectern, smoothed the blue wool at her cuffs, touched the small locket that had outlived every previous plan, and lifted her gaze. The room grew quiet with the attentive hush that forges courage. She began not with credentials, but with a road. Boston parlors that praised manners while tightening judgment. A train west where usefulness seemed the only ticket that mattered. A ranch in Wyoming where mornings began with chores, sums, and bread. Where grief breathed without spectacle, and where love learned to wear boots. She told them how failure to meet a single expectation had tried to compress her into a smaller life, and how tending fever, stitching wounds, teaching children, and holding a household upright can enlarge a soul until shame has no corner to hide. Hands stilled over notebooks. A woman in the back leaned forward. So far her hatpin caught candlelight and flashed like a star. Eleanor's voice, once the size of survival, filled the rafters and collected on the balcony rail. She described Dr. Laura Peterson's clinic, shelves lined with clean jars and labeled bottles, metal warmed before skin, bandages folded so they opened true, records kept neat for nights when memory sleeps, and the shared discipline that transforms haste into order. She spoke of a blacksmith who donated oranges because hope often needs something bright to bite, of a neighbor who built caller schedules so weary patients could rest, and of a town that learned to trust women's steadiness as infrastructure rather than decoration. Applause rose once, then stilled at a lifted hand. She did not preach sorrow as romance. She described sorrow as a weather system that you respect, prepare for, and outlast together. When she reached the ridge where biology had tried to limit her worth, she chose careful words that would land like bridges. A family can be built from vows kept daily, from bread, stories, mended shirts, fences repaired before storms, and tenderness that refuses to wait for permission. Motherhood, she said, is not a single route through the body. It is a way of standing between harm and a child with love that does not run. Worth is not assigned by nature or neighbors. Worth is practiced, proved, and shared. The hall exhaled, and a sound like rain on a tin roof gathered across palms. She told them about Clara, who now taught pupils to count in rows as straight as fence lines. About twins who turned wind into water with a machine that hummed like a low song on cold morning. About a quiet girl who painted fog so true that storekeepers asked for the ridge in miniature. About a child who once whispered, now writing pages that stitched courage into sentences. And about a boy who shouted mama with the unconcern of someone secure. She did not list her diagnosis. She spoke of a promise made on a porch under stars and of a partnership that measures legacy by lives steadied rather than blood prolonged. When she ended the first part, pens scratched madly. Then the chairwoman asked for practical instruction. Eleanor taught the conference how to boil instruments, mix willow bark tea, spot warning signs in winter lungs, and set up a night schedule that saves the nurse from collapse. She called for training circles in every town within a day's ride, urged supply lists to be posted at stores, and asked pastors to tie sermons to water, air, hygiene, and mercy. Questions came rapidly. What do we do when the fever won't break? How do we convince a foreman to quarantine? How can a mother speak to a doctor who will not answer her? Eleanor answered each with steps, then a story that honored the person who had faced it. By the time the lamp wicks were trimmed,
The hall rang with a second applause that sounded like weather turning fair. Letters were pressed into her hands. A woman whispered that a night once kept her small, then thanked the speaker for words that had widened a ceiling. Eleanor folded those notes into her satchel beside a new schedule Dr. Peterson had drawn for class. A day later, the city receded like a postcard, slipping behind a window. Rails carried her along river and ridge, and the train's pulse braided with a certainty that home would meet every fear halfway and finish the journey together. The wagon waited where the road met the platform, Samuel holding the reins with a grin that took years off his face. The children clustered like constellations, each bright in a different degree. They had chosen the day as a holiday and named it Arrival Day, the calendar square that marked 5 years since she stepped off another train and changed the shape of a household. Back at the ranch, banners stitched by many hands hung from porch posts. Pies cooled along the sill. The brown dog paraded with a ribbon tied correctly on the third try, and neighbors arrived with congratulations, jokes, and a careful readiness to listen for every detail she wished to share. The twins guided her past the windmill and boasted of a new gasket that knew how to hold against storms. To prove it, they opened a valve and sent water singing into a trough that shone like a small mirror. Clara presented a class list and a letter from her head teacher, praising patience and conviction, and asked about a night course for mothers who could not leave kitchens at dusk. Abigail revealed a painting destined for the store window. The clinic door cracked open, lamplight gilding bottles, a shadow of 2 women busy within. The brushwork honored both skill and fellowship. Hannah read a short piece about a traveler who discovers that maps lie less than people do, and that truth often waits under a porch like a fox, clever, watchful, ready to be fed courage. Benjamin leaped into Eleanor's arms and announced that the bell had rung exactly once, precisely on time, and that no one had laughed when he stumbled, which was proof that rules and kindness can share a evening through fire across the high country, an autumn sunset pouring wine over ridges until even fence wire glowed. The yard became an amphitheater built from hay bales, steps, and the tailgate of a wagon. Miss Thompson told stories about winter lantern lines and about a calf delivered in a storm, with half the town holding towels. The blacksmith claimed he could prove gratitude weighs more than iron, and set down a stack of gifts to demonstrate. Peterson stood near the porch rail with a smile that carried pride and relief, and leaned to say the state association wanted a training program under Eleanor's hand, a permanent circle where girls and women would learn to do the work nights demand. Samuel listened, eyes warm, then asked if she would lead it with the same steadiness she had given this house. Her yes landed like a beam set across 2 strong posts. Lanterns kindled as stars rose, pie plates emptied. The dog concluded a tour of inspection and curled against Benjamin's boots. Music came thin from a mouth harp. Children clapped, men kept time on their knees, and women laughed at a joke told in 3 counties. Eleanor stood in the doorway and felt the porch boards remember every vow the house had heard. Shame no longer gave orders, purpose did, and that purpose wore the faces of people she loved. Later, after dishes, after farewells, after quiet spread through rooms and meadow, she laid out her notes for the Denver talk again, not to rehearse, but to transform them into lessons for the circle she would start next month. She wrote headings for boiling, splinting, record-keeping, night watches, and the simple courtesies that keep despair from gathering at bedsides. Then she stepped outside to breathe the cold and look at the wind combing the dark grass, feeling the valley hum like a well-kept machine. In the distance, the windmill ticked once, sure of its labor. She breathed, felt the floor steady beneath her shoes, and believed the path ahead would honor labor, mercy, and truth, whatever storms arrived over mountains or through crowded rooms anywhere. Eleanor found her purpose against all odds. What's your story of triumphs? Subscribe, share your thoughts, and click the stories on your screen to join our journey of hope and resilience.